Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's London Speaker Bureau webinar. We hope you're all safe and well, and thank you for taking the time to join. We're delighted and honoured to have Helle Thorning-Schmidt today on a range of subjects, and we've also made some time for some Q&As towards the end of the webinar. Helle is a former Prime Minister of Denmark and the former CEO of Save the Children, and Ryan Chilcote is an award-winning broadcaster, presenter, and journalist who is currently special correspondent for PBS NewsHour. As always, please feel free to use the Q&A option, which you can access at the bottom of the screen to send questions to our panelists. And with that, I will pass it over to Ryan and Helle.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you to the London Speaker Bureau for inviting me to host this that London Speaker Bureau is, bar none, the best speaker bureau, and it's a real honor to be doing this. Not only was our guest, the Prime Minister of Denmark, the first woman to hold that position in the history of that country, but she also led the Social Democratic Party in Denmark for a full 10 years. And as you were mentioning there, immediately upon finishing those two not so small jobs, she immediately raced into being the CEO of Save the Children, saving children around the world. And she's on to more exciting things, and she's made some time for us today. So Helle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to Ryan.
So I'm sure, like many people in our audience, I've been oscillating between, over these 10 weeks of lockdown despair on the one hand and waxing philosophical that surely when we come out of this on the other side, this has been one big experiment, and there must be some hack for the world in all of it, and we're going to come out in a better place. I know you've talked about how the big danger is that when we come out of the lockdown, when we emerge from the pandemic, when we return to that near normalcy, maybe either nothing will change or not enough will change, that as much as things change, they stay the same. Tell us, use that political acumen and that vision that got you the top job in Denmark. What should change as we come out of this?
First of all, yes, it is true that I think we all on a personal level and a global level, we've been going through a historic phase in our lives and also our lives together. And I had this feeling in the beginning of the pandemic that maybe everything changes, but also everything stays the same, because we will be very quick to go back to the bad old ways, all our old habits, because we're dying to go back to how things were before, both on a personal level, but also working between countries and our international cooperation. I kind of changed my mind a bit, because I think there's been so much division coming out of this crisis. So I do think that it will be harder to go back to the way things were. And one of the first divisions that we saw, apart from the divisions domestically, for example, in the UK, where I am now, or in the US, I think was the division in the European Union. And that division was so deep and so hostile. So for a while, it actually threatened to break up the European Union as we know it. Because the hostility from particularly the Southern European members, the open fighting between North and South was so severe that it could have threatened to break up the Union as we know it. Now we're seeing new tones from the European Union. We're seeing a completely new partnership between France and Germany, which will enable the European Union to stick together. And I think that is a really good example of sometimes the divide has to be so big that you understand could actually be the end of of the European Union, and then a solution comes to bring things together again. So hopefully.
Yeah, sorry, so you're alluding to the European Recovery Plan there. Everybody's reading about it in the newspaper today. The European Commission saying that 750 billion euros should be set aside to help countries pull through this. People are saying this is the beginning of, in a good sense, I guess, the United States of Europe, a turning point. I know you're a big European. You went to the College of Europe. You've been fighting for a united Europe. You reckon that this pandemic has influenced Europe for the better?
In the beginning, it influenced Europe for the worse, because there's no doubt that because this is not a competence of the European Union. Health is a national competence. The European Union had very few levers to actually help in this pandemic. And we saw that every country was out for themselves. They put up border controls. They gave full speed on state aid, and the European Union had very little role to play. And then there was also the acrimony between countries. Italy asking for help in late February, not getting any reply at all, and at the same time heard more from the Chinese than the European Union. So it definitely had the energy to break the European Union apart. But luckily, and this is because that's how the European Union works, every time it looks like this is going to be the end of the European Union, some countries will come together with the Commission to suggest a massive help package for
the debt crisis. Tell me, let me. Yeah. And during the debt crisis, we certainly saw that it looked like it was all going to go up in smoke. And then at the last minute, after days and days of negotiating behind closed doors, they found a deal. I know you went to Brussels. You must have been hundreds of times, dozens of times in any case, when you were Prime Minister, and were inside the room doing the hard political deals as one of the 28 then members of the European Union. They can't do that now. This is kind of a quirky question, but can they work through, because not everybody is signed up to this little recovery plan, not all of the countries. Can the strong arming and the persuasion happen, over formats, over platforms like the one you and I are talking on now?
It is. I mean, it is very. I've been in Brussels, working in Brussels for many years, and it is very hard to do these kind of negotiations on Zoom. I mean, we are in a very cordial, nice conversation here, but if you imagine that we had to sort out a disagreement, it would be much harder. At some point, we would want to be close to each other and find a solution. So this is really hard negotiating climate. What you can see in Europe is that the group of countries that are in the austerity group, Denmark, Netherlands, Austria, and Sweden, is getting smaller and smaller. Obviously, with the UK leaving, they are weaker, and with Germany parting from that group, this is a much weaker group than it ever has been. So I'm convinced there will be a solution where the European Union will recover with this enormous help package. And by the way, it's the only right thing to do because we also have to get rid of this enormous state aid that countries are using. That's really bad for exporting countries. So I think there will be a solution here, and the negotiations have to take place over the phone, and there will be many hours spent on this. I hope they can meet, because this is very important for Europe.
Helle, let me ask you a little bit about the sort of global political climate. So I'm not sure who's going to show up, but President Trump is still hoping to host the G7 at the end of the month. Even if, let's assume that the situation is improved and everybody agrees to show up. I mean, I was at the NATO meeting. I've been at a lot of the other G7 meetings. The climate was acrimonious, I think, is how you could describe it, even before the pandemic. When you talk about building this sort of better world post-pandemic, given that context, how do you do that? Because I'm not alone in saying that there doesn't really appear to be a whole lot of leadership in a global sense right now.
You're absolutely right. And I think the pandemic has exacerbated some of the conflicts that we saw before. For example, the question of oil and oil production. There we have Russia versus Saudi Arabia versus US. So it's a big triangle of acrimony. Then we have the relationship with China, which used to be on trade, China versus the US. Now you can add handling of the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, where everyone is accusing China for not having reacted quickly enough. And of course, you can add the discussion over Hong Kong, which is taking place, and the US getting more and more people more and more countries on board to their side of it. So that has just deepened, and new factors have been added all the time. Then, of course, you have the question of the vaccine. Hopefully, we will get a vaccine at some stage, but with US actively leaving the work pulled together by the World Health Organization, US is not only actively leaving or abandoning leadership in this field, but also almost obstructing that we work together on finding a vaccine. And why is that so important? Yes, of course, it's important we work together on finding a vaccine, but it's also important when we actually find the vaccine that not only wealthier countries have access to that vaccine. So there's so many things where we can see that leadership is, there's no leadership. Normally in a crisis like this, for example, after 9/11, we would have the US leading our way out of it, propped up and supported or assured by the UK. And right now we're seeing those two particular countries being completely split internally. We have huge debates in the UK right now about the leadership and how handling this pandemic, and particularly individuals who didn't follow the rules. And in the US, it's become over-politicized, this handling of the pandemic. So the two countries we would expect to be leaders in a crisis like this are in fights with other countries and not assuming that leadership. So that is a big deal. So I'm hoping that the G7 can go on. It doesn't matter to me so much whether they can meet in person or via Zoom, but it has to go on because the world really needs leadership.
You mentioned vaccines there. You know, it just made me think about the report we got yesterday in the United States that 20% of Americans say that they won't take a vaccine, they won't get the vaccine even when it exists. I want to take the conversation in a slightly different direction. One of the exciting things that you're now embarking on is you're going to be the co-chair of an independent oversight board for Facebook, sort of guiding the editorial, making sure it's a safe and fair place for people to discuss ideas, and the decisions are binding, which I know was really important to you. You know that Facebook has been blamed by many people for allowing the spread of a lot of misinformation about this pandemic. How does Facebook and your board help to build that better world post-pandemic?
Yeah, first of all, a few words about this oversight board where I'm one of 4 co-chairs. The idea behind this co-chair is that we will have an appeal function for Facebook. So if a piece of content is removed from Facebook or Instagram, the user will have the ability now, not only first to complain to Facebook as they have now, but if they're not happy with the answer they get from Facebook, they can appeal to this oversight board. And we will have to look into the case. We have no dependency on Facebook. We don't have to look at Facebook's economic or performance or their reputation. So we are independent of Facebook, and our decisions have to be followed by Facebook. That's part of the whole deal behind this oversight board. And you are right. Many of these discussions will come up. Obviously, the oversight board is not working yet with real cases, so we haven't looked into that. But it is very likely that some of the issues that we're dealing with right now on the pandemic, on elections in the US, will be brought to the oversight board. And we will just have to look at this. And the balance is this: how do we balance freedom of expression, which is so dear to so many people? Facebook and Instagram has given voice to so many people across the world. How do we balance that freedom of expression with someone else's human rights? That is what we are trying to find here. And Facebook is struggling with that every day with their community standards. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it very wrong. And they have then asked this oversight board to look at these cases. And then there's the other part of your question about false information. How do we deal with false information on the internet? And I think this is a deep, almost philosophical conversation, because, for example, the Brazilian president, Bolsonaro, he has been very out saying this is not a real issue. We should not abide by these distancing regime. And is it then the job of social media to bring these things, which are clearly false, bring these things so we can all see what is actually the Brazilian president telling his people, or should they try to suppress these things? Yesterday we had another example with or the day before we had another example with the American president having opinions about the American election. Is it then the job of social media to try and spread this information and try to discuss it? or to suppress it. So I think this is almost a philosophical discussion about what do we want to know about these ideas, or do we not want to know about these ideas?
Members of the audience, Helle and I am sure could go on for hours discussing this subject, but I want to remind you that you have the opportunity to ask her questions. So send those questions into the chat. We look forward to seeing them, and I will just continue because I have about 50 questions to ask, and we only have
you just go ahead.
We only have another 13 minutes. Look, a lot of the people in our audience, Helle, are not in politics. That's what you and I have been talking about so far. They're in business, they're in finance. So what would you say to them? How can they help build this better world?
Yeah, I mean, even though you're not in politics, the thing is with this pandemic and the economic crisis that will follow, that it will impact all of us. So even though we're not interested in the fight between Saudi Arabia and US on oil prices, or not interested in a massive European help package, it will impact all of us deeply. And I work in business as well. I sit on a board on a number of commercial boards and companies, and really involved in that. And I think for us as business leaders, we have to think about, first of all, how can we change our own business and adapt to this situation. Just yesterday, I had 2 board meetings, and one of the things we were discussing was how can we actually take the efficiencies that we have seen in this pandemic and bring it into the new situation, and thereby actually adjusting our business to a new normal. That will, for example, mean that we do much more on Zoom. We don't love it, any of us, but it is very, very effective instead of spending a lot of money on travel budgets and time and CO2, we should meet on Zoom more. And there will be many other efficiencies that we as business leaders can help catch in this situation. So that's one thing which is very close to home. I also think there's another thing which is close to home. How do our employees work from now? How do we balance this working from home or coming into the office? I hope we can find a sensible balance, because I also think as human beings, we need to be together sometimes and talk and be together, not in a physical room, albeit perhaps physically distant. So that's one thing really close to home. But the other thing is that I think business leaders also have to take their responsibility in pushing our leaders to take the right choices. That's in terms of when do countries open again. Some countries are opening very late and want to have everything in place before they open, but it's also these big help packages. When do they stop? And when can we go back to a more normal life? So the sad message to business leaders is there's a lot to do home in our own business, but there's also a lot to do on in the political field, because politics and economics has perhaps never been as linked as it is right now.
And I know you care a lot about the climate, and there's a lot of talk about how the recovery effort, all the money that's going to be spent to stimulate economies should be geared towards building a greener economy. One thing I want to ask you, and we have to go into speed Q&A because we're just a couple of minutes from taking questions from the audience, but is that really possible? I mean, you look at the numbers. Do we have the time and money to pursue these sort of lofty things like a greener world? I'm being the devil's advocate here. When you look at the United States, you've got tens of millions of people in the U.S., same thing in the U.K., around the world, that have already lost, people who have already lost their jobs or are about to lose their jobs. Is this really the time to sort of launch into this greener economy?
I really see where you're coming from, because for people who have lost their job, that's the only thing that matters. People want to get back into work. They don't want to live off government money forever. People just want their job back. And I hope that many will get their job back. But I also think this should be seen as an opportunity to change our economy. I think that many of us living in urban environments, I live in London myself, have felt how changed everything is, with the cleaner air, with everything that seems different this spring. We have all seen that perhaps we could do more meetings like this rather than traveling as much as we did before. And I do think that changing the world to combat climate change is not a nice to have, it's a need to have. And I, being Danish, of course, have seen what an enormous part of industry this can actually be. In Denmark, green industry is a bigger industry in our farming industry now, which says a lot from an old farming country. Disclaimer here, I sit on the board of Vestas, one of the biggest windmill companies in the world. So what we need now is to change the economy and use this time to create more jobs in the green energy sector, for example, because that will create new solid jobs and also at the same time be good for the next generation. So we need to use this as an opportunity, and it's not a nice to have, it's a need to have. And if we just invest, if we invest in this now, it will actually be something that we can create new, better jobs for the future.
Yeah, I remember when we saw that video of the dolphins in the canals of Venice. I think everyone said, wow, that's extraordinary when the pandemic was. We've got some questions. This one from Natasha. What do you foresee the future skills and values of the next generation will be, and how are they going to be similar or different to today's values in the workplace?
Yeah, I'm actually super worried about the next generation, young people, millennials, people in their 20s. Just think of these people. I've got 2 adult daughters myself. Think of these young adults. They have seen the crisis of 2008 and the aftermath of that. Many lost their job, particularly in Southern Europe. Many lost their jobs back then and they have never had a really good foothold on the labor market. And now this comes, pushes them out once again. And my biggest worry actually is the political backlash that we might have from a generation which has been let down twice and have not given a real strong chance to be part of the labor market as my generation were. So I'm very worried about that. And that's why I think all these economic packages, they are very good to have right now, but what's most important is what they will do for the next generation. And I'm hoping what the next generation will take from this is a political leadership that works for them, delivering when they had to. I'm not so sure about that, but that's what I'm hoping. But also a political leadership that pushes for the changes that we have to have in terms of protecting our nature and combating climate change. And if we don't live up to that, our generation of leaders, I think we will have let the next generation down. So I'm hoping that they will take part themselves in elections wherever they can, but also that they will not see us as having let them down once again, leaving a big bill for climate change, a big bill for this pandemic, a big bill from the old crisis from 2008, but actually trying to pick the bills up that we have created.
We got another question here from Marta Amoros. She says, what is the key role that international NGOs you think may play now to really add value and help give answers to the current challenges worldwide? I mean, it's an interesting one, right? Because we know that NGOs, and you know this better than almost anybody, are under pressure right now. They're not getting the money that they were getting before. What do you say to that question?
Oh, it's a huge issue. I mean, I know many big NGOs like Save the Children, which I worked for, but also small NGOs that are not getting the funding. And it's so sad because it's exactly now that those NGOs are needed. It might be NGOs helping children, it might be NGOs helping for mental issues. So there's so many NGOs that we need right now. So I want to tell everyone, if businesses want a purpose, try and help NGOs in this difficult time. But I'm also thinking that with all these political crises that I talked about before, the life of NGOs is always harder. So when the world is in flames and governments are fighting, NGOs get squeezed out and make it harder to help. Look at, for example, the big hotspots of the world right now, Yemen, Afghanistan, Libya, where the crisis has just gone from bad to really worse over these months. NGOs can't work there anymore, and it's not safe to send people out. So not only are NGOs suffering, but perhaps more importantly, the people that they're trying to help are suffering enormously. So help them as much as we can, and that's also maybe a job for business leaders.
A quick one for you here from me. Are women better equipped to build that, women leaders, to build that better future post-pandemic? I ask this because obviously I want to be egalitarian and a good citizen. But also, it's a topic that's getting a lot of attention right now because of for example, the current Prime Minister of Denmark, and another woman, because of Angela Merkel's leadership. There are people out there who are saying that the female politicians are doing a better job at leading their countries through the coronavirus than their male counterparts. Anything to that?
I've been asked this question a lot. It's a funny question. I'm a total feminist myself. I own up to that. But I don't think there's a huge difference between men and women as prime ministers. And I can see many male leaders that have done a very good job. What I think the leaders that have succeeded in this crisis are leaders that have managed to unite their population rather than split their population. And that is, for example, the case in Denmark, in Norway, in Germany, to a certain extent France as well. Leaders that have actually managed to say, this is not a government telling you what to do. This is something that we do in consultation with a wider political spectrum, other political parties, but also civil society, and do consultations and make the changes that we had to make after as a response to Corona, something that society did together rather than something that governments are imposing on the population. So I think what has won in this crisis is cooperation, consultation, compromise, more than this acting too late and acting without consultation. And I think we have a particularly bad case of political leadership in the US, for example, where it has been turned into a very charged political debate. And of course, I'm not super impressed with the British government's handling of this crisis, because again, it has done more as a PR exercise. Many of the things that has happened, it's more PR exercise than actually real solutions to real problems that fit into people's real lives. So I think that's where the distinction is, rather than male-female leaders.
So before we sat down for our conversation in quarantine, I thought to myself, well, okay, what has gotten better for me that I think would be good in the future during this pandemic? I thought about how, my wife and I got a lesson in how to cut my hair from a barber over Zoom, right? The wonders we're discovering of technology, the hundreds of hours, thousands of hours I'm now spending with my children round the clock. The fact that, as you were pointing out, we don't always have to go into an office anymore. I can be chatting with you, without any socks on right now, which I won't show you. Give us one more thing one more positive, and we have just a minute, 30 seconds. One more positive we can could and should take away from this pandemic going forward.
I think the biggest thing I think we've all made pledges to ourselves about how we want to live after this. My pledge to myself is that I don't want to travel as much. I want to be a little bit less busy. And I think the pledges that we have made to ourselves, maybe for once we should try and actually activate them after the pandemic. There's so often we make pledges to ourselves and then it's all forgotten afterwards. But if we can do one thing that will not only change our own life, but also change other people's lives, maybe this time we should actually keep that pledge to ourselves, and that I think would make the world a little bit better place. And we can all do our bit. So I would recommend everyone make that pledge and try and keep it this time. And I'm saying that as much to myself as to anyone else.
Thank you very much. And I will keep my petty pledge to London Speaker Bureau and hand this back after thanking you, Helle, for this conversation. Like I was telling everyone, we could go on for hours, but it's been fantastic to speak with you, and fantastic for London Speaker Bureau to give us this platform to speak.
And thank you for having me, London Speaker Bureau, and yourself, Ryan. It's been a true pleasure.
Great. Thanks everyone for joining today. It was great to hear from Helle, and next week we will be hearing from Shivi Jervis and Matthew Scott. We will be in touch on that, and thanks again for joining. Thanks. Take care.